Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
This is one of those interviews where as soon as the publishers team emailed us and said that this author was doing interviews, I was like, we have to have her on. I think I typed maybe an all caps message to Tracy to that effect. Mm-hmm. I know I kind of jumped up and down in my seat and kind of sent a note to the publisher to that effect. That her that we're speaking of is Stephanie Jones-Rodger. She's an assistant professor at Berkeley's Department of History. And in 2013, her dissertation won the Lerner Scott Prize, which is given to the best doctoral dissertation in U.S. women's history each year.
So she took that dissertation and expanded it into the book that's the topic of today's episode. That book is They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. This book uses financial and transactional records to corroborate accounts from formerly enslaved people about their experiences. And the resulting work is unflinching and difficult, but also really important in how it affects our knowledge about the business of slavery and specifically white women's place in it.
So first up, Stephanie shared what led her to this area of study, and then she talks a good bit about how she conducted her research. So the first thing I have to ask is what first drew you to this particular avenue of research and writing?
So I went to Rutgers University and I was studying with Deborah Gray White, the great Deborah Gray White. And so as I was completing my coursework back in 2009, I began to explore the work that had been done on formerly enslaved people in the 19th century, as well as that scholarship that had been produced about white Southern women. And so, I became really interested in the question of whether white Southern women, particularly married women, had an economic stake in the institution of slavery, whether they invested economically in the institution. And that question seemed to have two answers emerged in those two subfields of history. So in the histories written about white Southern women and their relationship to slavery, the way that relationship was characterized was primarily in all of these non-economic ways. So ideologically, socially, even, indirectly, perhaps economic in its basis, but largely there was this idea that white women in the South had a very distanced relationship to slavery, and far more often that married women had no economic relationship to the institution of slavery, in large part because of the ways that laws constrained married women's ability to own property and to hold on to and control property after marriage. But on the other hand, those scholars who looked at the experiences of African Americans during this period, and particularly enslaved people, were saying something very different. They were drawing on a different set of sources, and they were saying that formerly enslaved people talked about female owners. They talked about being bought and sold by women. They talked about other individuals who they knew in their communities who had been owned, bought, or sold by women. And so I was really interested in this disconnect and became frustrated by that disconnect between these two subfields of history. And so I was really interested in addressing that question head on, addressing the question of whether white women had an a deep economic investment in the institution of slavery, and also showing what those investments looked like from the perspectives of those individuals who they owned and had the most intimate and deep experience of their control and their ownership and control. And those were formerly enslaved people, of course. So that was really where it started, from kind of a frustration, a moment of frustration. And then it grew from there. The project, rather, not the frustration. The project grew from there.
Did you find it difficult to track down information and accounts about white women's role in slavery and their economic stake in it?
So what I thought was really fascinating was that, I just kind of briefly mentioned it just now, is that it seemed that the reason why there was this disconnect between, or this lack of consensus around the question of whether white women and married white women in particular had an economic investment and stake in the institution of slavery, was largely driven by different source bases. So the scholars of white Southern women were typically using the letters and the diaries of white Southern women to craft these accounts and histories of white Southern women's relationships to slavery, whereas those individuals who focused on the experiences of African Americans were using these interviews that were conducted by federal employees at the behest of the federal government during the 1930s and 1940s, where formerly enslaved people were asked about their experiences in bondage. And so for me, it was, okay, which of these sources I go to first? I went to the diaries and the letters of white Southern women to see what they had to say about their economic investments in the institution. And while, yes, they did talk about it, they didn't talk about it often, and they didn't talk about the sale and purchase of enslaved people very often. And so I then said, okay, well, the people who are talking about it most frequently are those individuals who are subjected to this control, this power, the sales, and the purchases and the separations that were brought about by these sales. So I looked to formerly enslaved people's testimonies and their interviews, and used the information that they provided in those interviews to help me to develop a strategy for where to go next. So by listening to what they had to say, by reading and being very attentive to what they were saying about white women's economic investments in the institution, I was able to develop a kind of course of action. So from their interviews, I then went to financial records and found women, just as they said I would, in the records that documented the purchase and sale of enslaved people. They were identified as both the buyers and the sellers of enslaved people. I found them in court records where, if someone had sold them an enslaved person who was unwell, and that person didn't disclose an illness to them when they purchased them, they could go into court and sue them. So I found women, who owned enslaved people in legal records and court records. And during the Civil War, I found them in military correspondence between Union officers as well as, Confederate officials. And then, of course, there were slave traders, individuals, typically men, who as a job, their profession, bought and sold enslaved people for a living. And I found women in their account books and in letters that they wrote to their business partners. So by paying close attention to what formerly enslaved people said about these married women's economic relationships to the institution of slavery, I was able to find them in all of these other bodies of sources and documents, basically corroborating and legitimating what formerly enslaved people had to say about white married women's economic investments in the institution.
So I'm glad you touched on that, because one of the things I really, really love about this book is that you do destroy that tendency that has happened over years and years and years for people to dismiss some of these accounts from formerly enslaved people as unreliable by backing up their stories with a ton of corroborating documentation. Like, you have all the receipts. At what point did you realize that you were going to be able to piece this puzzle together in that way and finally validate some of those voices with evidence that cannot be disputed?
Well, I thought what was really fascinating is so what I did, what I said to myself first is that who better to tell us what how deeply invested white women were in the economy of slavery than those individuals who they owned. And so by starting from the position that no one could tell us the story of white slave-owning women's economic investments in the institution more clearly, more cogently, and more powerfully than formerly enslaved people, I took them seriously. I took them at their word. And then I started to realize, it wasn't hard to make these connections and to corroborate the evidence because, for example, there were individuals who identified their former female owners by first and last name, even by their maiden names. So there were all these ways in which they gave me the data that I would need or the information that I would need to be able to go to other sources like the census, for example. So I could read what one formerly enslaved person said about an owner, say, okay, they gave me the first, middle, and last name of this person, the approximate area where they grew up, so where the person lived, and I would go to the census, and there's the woman, that they talked about. So, just by taking them very seriously, and using their sources in a way that we use other sources, like Washington, George Washington, letters or his, diary or whatever, I was able to go to these other sources and find the women exactly where they said they would be, and in the way that they characterized them. I was able to find information that was basically it suggested that they were quite accurate in their characterizations of the institution, but also the ways in which they implicated white Southern women and white married women in particular in the economy of American slavery and continued subjugation.
So the evidence has all been there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it took so long for someone like you to go, we can put this stuff together?
So on the one hand, so I should say that there are, of course, many scholars who have looked to these sources and have produced these really extraordinary studies of, kind of the complexities of slavery. And they have also implicated, white women in the story of slavery. But the economic dimension, particularly when it comes to married women, I think is, on the one hand, a issue related to the laws at the time, and I'll just mention briefly. So there was a legal doctrine called coverture, which essentially mandated that if a woman who was either single or widowed owned any property before marriage, once she became married, once she married, all of the wealth that she brought into the marriage would automatically become her husband's. So unless women figured out ways around this law, around these property laws, that constrained and limited their ability to own and control property and enslaved people, this is what would happen. And so for a very long time, many scholars of slavery and many scholars of Southern women really just, I think, embraced this idea that this was a very all-encompassing kind of legal system, a legal doctrine that really did foreclose the possibility that married women could, in fact, own and control enslaved people in the ways that I show in the book. But what I did again is go to what formerly enslaved people had to say. And so they were saying things like, oh, my mistress owned me by law and not her husband. So I'm like, well, what do they mean by law? How could this be? And so what I found in the legal records is that women, these white Southern women who owned enslaved people, particularly those who were married, were very explicit about how they came to own enslaved people. They would provide documents and provide proof to the court that in that proof, what they would demonstrate was that there was this chain of ownership, that they would establish the means by which they came to acquire enslaved people as their own. And so what those documents also show is that married women found ways around these legal constraints. And so by listening to what formerly enslaved people had to say, I was able to then even kind of conceive of the idea that this was possible. And by thinking about this as a possibility, I then had to show how it was possible. And so the legal records show the ways in which women were very savvy in navigating, using loopholes and navigating around some of these constraints imposed upon them. So I think in large part it was because of the way that we thought about these laws and the kind of constraints imposed upon women in this period because of married women in this period because of the law. The other thing I think is because, women's history was born in a moment in which the women's movement was powerful, it was gaining momentum. And so the histories that were produced in that moment, they were also part of that project, part of a feminist project. And this is and I say it all the time, this is a very ugly feminist history. From one angle, these women are able to secure a kind of freedom and autonomy in their lives in ways that we would not imagine or that would be fathomable for these women in this period. But they're able to do that by owning enslaved people, by owning and oppressing other people. That's the ugly dimension of this very feminist story. So I think in some ways it's a story that doesn't mesh well. It didn't mesh well with the feminist project of the 60s and the 70s. So I think those are two primary reasons why I think, although the sources have been there and people had mulled over the sources and produced extraordinary studies using these same sources, those things I think kind of foreclose the possibility that this particular story would be told in the way that I did.
Coming up, Stephanie and I talk about how she coped with facing research that was often really upsetting and really weighed on her. But first, we're going to take a little break and hear from one of our sponsors. One of the things about this book is that there are a lot of accounts in it that you shared that were relayed by formerly enslaved people, and they are stories that are so important, but they are also really difficult to read in some cases. It's a lot of very heavy, ugly information. Did research and writing on this subject ever get a little bit overwhelming for you? Did you ever have to just be like, not anymore today?
That was a very frequent experience for me. I mean, admittedly, for some of your listeners may not know, but I am an African American woman. I am the descendant of sharecroppers. I am the descendant of Southerners. I am the descendant of formerly enslaved people, and so from that position, it was very difficult from a personal position for me to write this book because I'm too learning about what my ancestors endured. But also at the same time, as a historian, it was very difficult for me to grapple with the atrocities that were perpetrated against formerly enslaved people and that they survived. But what I often reminded myself of when I would take a minute, sometimes I would have to take a day or two off because it was just so emotionally impactful for me. And what I would often remind myself of is that these formerly enslaved people, these African Americans, were giving these interviews in a time of lynching, in a time of severe racial hostility and racial terror and racial violence. And they did that in spite of the risks and the dangers. And so that underscores to me how important they thought it was for us as a nation to know their stories, to know what they had endured, and to grapple with that as part of our national history. So for me, it was a duty in many respects for me to return to these accounts, to return to the writing in order to do justice to the formerly enslaved people who sat down and risked their lives in many respects to tell their stories. So for me, although it was difficult, and I know for readers, it's very hard to read many of the accounts that I put forth in this book, but I always want to bring it back to the fact that these were individuals who thought it was so important for us to know what happened to them and to know what they survived and to know that this was part of our national story, So that's the thing that brings me back to the work every single time.
Oh, and they are so important. One of the things that you talk about in this book is how young girls in white families were given this identity of being slave owners as part of their upbringing, which is something I don't think we always think about children kind of being involved from an early age. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, many of the histories that we do have about white women and slavery, white women in the context of slavery, often start when they are adults, when they are married, when they have already, kind of lived these childhoods and girlhoods and have, they were raised up in the South. But often the story of their relationship to slavery begins when they're adults and when they're in marriages or in widowhood. And so for me, that was really interesting because formerly enslaved people started the story in infancy, so they talked about white girls, even white infants, white female infants, who were given enslaved people as gifts, whether at birth, for birthdays, whether as Christmas gifts. Many times, in many cases, they were given enslaved people as wedding presents. So, formerly enslaved people talked about the fact that well before these women married, they were developing identities as Southern women or Southern females identities that were tied to either actual slave ownership or the promise of slave ownership at a later date. And so for me, it was really important to begin the story there because it helps to explain a lot of stuff that happens later on. It helps to explain why, for example, when women were married, when slave owning women married, that the women in this book that I talk about in this book weren't willing to relinquish their control over enslaved people and other forms of property to their husbands. They had developed these identities that were tied to their ability to own and control enslaved people and to own property. So they weren't willing to just simply relinquish that control to their husbands. So it explains that when you start the story when they're little girls and you see how profoundly slavery shaped their identities as Southerners, as white Southerners in particular. So that's why I start the story there, because that's really where I think we need to begin in order to understand what unfolds over the course of their lives, particularly once they reach adulthood.
You also talk kind of on the other end of the timeline spectrum about how white women defended the institution of slavery, particularly as it was becoming apparent that it was coming to an end. Will you talk a little bit about that as well?
One of the things that other historians who've looked at white women's relationships to the institution of slavery have shown is that slave-owning parents typically gave their daughters more slaves than they did in land. So what they had in mind, this idea that when their children married, that they would have they wanted them to have everything that they needed to get a great start. So what they would typically do is they would give their sons the land and would give their daughters more enslaved people, so that once those daughters and sons married, they would have everything they needed to get started, get a household started. And so when you think about the fact that many of the women in this book are often, if not a significant slave owner in the household that they go into when they marry, there are others that are primarily the only slaveholders in the household. Some of these women are the only property owners in the household. So they are the ones who bring both the slaves and the land in rare cases, to the household. So their husbands' identities are not necessarily tied to slavery and slave ownership in the ways that their wives are. And so when the Civil War emerges and it becomes kind of clear, the writing is on the wall, that emancipation is inevitable, that the dissolution of slavery is around the corner, these women, who are in some cases more deeply invested, economically invested in the institution of slavery, more profoundly tied to the institution of slavery and slave ownership than their husbands, they understand that the war means, that emancipation means their financial ruin. So they are fighting tooth and nail to preserve the institution of slavery, not simply as indirect beneficiaries of the institution, but because they have a direct economic stake in the institution's preservation, because they are the primary or significant slave owners in their household. And so they understand that with emancipation, the value of those enslaved people that they hold in captivity is going to be gone. It's going to be zero. And so they will be financially destitute. So they fight throughout the war, they fight their own battle to preserve slavery, in large part because of these economic investments. And then when it's over, not only are they devastated because of the losses of the men and the boys in their lives who went off to war and never came back, but they are mourning a financial and economic loss. One woman described emancipation as an unprecedented robbery. These women saw that all this wealth, the value in enslaved people, was being stolen from them by the federal government. So they tried to recreate circumstances that looked very much like smacked of slavery, these kind of pseudo-slavery circumstances after the war was over, in hopes that they could hold on just for a little while longer, hold on to the kind of the value of free labor, meaning the labor that enslaved people offered to them or provided to them, or coerced to offer to them as the owners, as their legal owners. So it's really interesting that, when you think about women as slave owners and individuals who could in fact have been the only slaveholders in the household, the Civil War and white women's responses to the war look quite different.
Right.
And so that's what the book shows as well.
While you were doing your research, which is so extensive and I feel like so meticulous, did you come across any pieces of information that surprised you?
So there were two things that I thought were that I was just shocked by, even though I shouldn't have been, and because of all of the other things that formerly enslaved people had to say about these women. I shouldn't have been shocked to find out what I did. So one of the things that I really try to focus on in the book is these economic relationships and investments that white women had in the institution. And while it was it became kind of obvious to me after a while, after doing the research, that women would engage in slave market activities in the ways that they did. And by slave market, I mean there were really brick and mortar structures where individuals could go and essentially shop for enslaved people. Because I think some people don't realize that that's not a metaphor. It's it's like they were real markets. And so, I didn't expect to find out that some white women were involved in the business side of buying and selling enslaved people. So there's a woman that I talk about in the book who was part of a family business where she would front the money. So she would invest the money so that her nephew could buy the slaves and sell the slaves. And when he sold the slaves, she and her nephew would split the proceeds of those sales down the middle. So I didn't expect to find women who were involved in the business side of the slave trade and the business. I also didn't expect for formerly enslaved people to talk about white women who owned slaves and who created circumstances in which they coerced them into having sex against their will. So there were, in fact, slave-owning women who committed acts of sexual violence or created circumstances in which actual sexual violence could be perpetrated against enslaved people in this period. So that was another thing that was surprising to me, although, of course, now I think, thinking back on it, it shouldn't have been surprising. Right. But those are two things that were really surprising that I uncovered as I researched for this book.
In the next segment, Holly asks Stephanie about the way women who owned enslaved people saw themselves. But before we get into that, we will pause for a quick sponsor break.
You also include some discussion towards the end of the book about the disparity, and you've talked about it already in this interview some, between the way white women of the time wrote about the institution of slavery and their role in it versus the much uglier reality. And I wonder, do you think that was something of a PR move on their part in characterizing themselves as generally kind and benevolent mistresses or even innocent bystanders in some ways? Or do you think they actually believed they were those things?
I think that there were some individuals who really did believe that they were being kind of maternal, benevolent figures in the institution of slavery. But I think there were also many women who knew it was a lie, just right. To call it what it is, that they knew it was a lie. And so some of the women that I discuss in that part of the portion of the book that you're mentioning here, they were writing these books, and they have acknowledgments or dedications where they make it clear they are writing these books, these accounts for their descendants, for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So they are in a very calculated way, in a very purposeful way, constructing a whitewashed and sanitized narrative that positions them as these maternal, benevolent figures and positions slavery as a benevolent institution that was good for Black people. So they are very consciously constructing a narrative that they know is a lie. And so, of course, like you said, formerly enslaved people are like, that's a lie. That's a lie. And I'll tell you why it's a lie. So, you do see, yes, women, they did in fact style themselves as, kind of maternalist and benevolent figures. But nevertheless, there were others that knew it was a lie and constructed, narratives that erased the kind of darker dimensions, the more violent dimensions, and the economic dimensions of their investments in the institution very purposefully.
What's next for you? I know I read somewhere that you're collecting additional data about this topic.
Yes. So I have on a couple of hats. So one is a quantitative project, which I've been working on since about 2014, which essentially is trying to put the numbers in the story. So the book doesn't really offer statistics, and that was intentional on my part, in large part because I'm continuing to work on the quantitative data, trying to determine, give a sense of just how many women were involved in the institution of slavery who owned slaves. And so I'm using census data and other smaller data sets throughout the South to construct a database, which will provide those numbers. And just from the preliminary research, I've learned that in some cases, women constituted 40% of the slaveholders in certain regions of the South. And I'm imagining that those numbers will also be replicated in the larger data sets because, there's been work done in Britain on slave owners who, filed for compensation once Britain abolished slavery, and women constituted 40% of the applicants for compensation in Britain. So there are ways in which I think these numbers, this 40% figure seems pretty consistent across slave owning groups during this period. So I imagine that the additional data that I look at, the quantitative data that I compile, will bear that out as well. So that's one of the immediate projects that I'm working on. And I'm also working on what I call the legal sequel of this project, because this one was primarily focused on, the economic dimensions of women's investments in institution, but the law made their ability to kind of manipulate the law and to work around certain laws made those economic investments possible. So I see this book as a kind of necessary kind of second follow-up to the first book. So I'm working on a kind of a legal history of white women's relationships to the institution of slavery.
Did you have any idea when you started down this path that it would consume so many years of your life?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
My deepest thanks to Stephanie for talking with me. She is an absolute delight. And long after the interview ended, I yacked her ear off about all manner of things. If you would like to catch up with her online, you can do so at stephaniejonesrogers.com. That's all run together. Or on Twitter, where she is SEJR_historian.
So the book, once again, is They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. And it's available wherever books are sold.
It is a really dense, like I mentioned in the interview, meticulously researched read. There is a lot of information in that book. And as we discussed, not always easy to read some of those accounts of really the horrible things humans can do to one another. But it's so, so good. I really, really loved it. I thought, though, since this was kind of a heavy topic, we would do some mostly light listener mail. So I'm doing a little bit of postcard roundup again. The first one is from, I'm not sure if the name is Jana or Jana, but it is a lovely postcard from Scotland. And Jana writes, Dear Holly and Tracy, I am about to finish my semester abroad in Edinburgh, Scotland. I wanted to write in and say thank you for keeping me company over the last couple of months. I am studying history, and y'all always help to remind me why I got into this business. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much, and I hope your time abroad has been spectacular, because that sounds lovely. It's a beautiful picture of Scotland, so thank you very much for that. Our next one, I won't read the whole thing, but I will mention it, is from our listener Allison, who sent, with my name with a couple of exclamation points, a beautiful picture of a silk dress that was from a 17th century shipwreck found in 2004 off the coast of the Dutch barrier island of, I think it is pronounced Texel. She mentioned some other things that were also found in that shipwreck, but it's a really cool photograph of this dress that I bet in its heyday was utterly spectacular to behold. It looks a little, like it has been in a shipwreck, but you can still see these vibrant pinks and yellows and really pretty weaving in the silk. So it's absolutely lovely. My last one, I'm not going to read because it includes some fairly personal information, but I wanted to just say hi to this listener and how much we appreciate this letter. It's from our listener, Jennifer, who wrote us about being on medical leave for some stuff and listening to our podcasts to kind of help her feel normal. And to me, that is a great honor that we get to in any way help someone get through a rough time. So thank you so much for your letter, Jennifer. We are thinking of you. And we're so thankful to have you as a listener. If you would like to write to us, you can do so at historypodcast@howstuffworks.com. You can also find us pretty much anywhere on social media as Missed in History. You can also visit our website, which is missedinhistory.com. And if you would like to subscribe to the show, that's something we highly encourage. You can do that on the iHeartRadio app, at Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.